Bernstein is a British sociologist. He started his work in the 1950s. He came into prominence in 1971 with a group in London that established what at that point was called a new sociology of education. And the new sociology of education was a response to the largely scientific approaches that had been taken in the past. He developed an interest in social matters, partly as a result of him working as a teacher in schools in London, where he became concerned about the educational failure amongst working class children. So working class children didn't do as well academically as middle class and upper class children. Now, up until this point, the commentators on these matters basically said, well, the reason for that is that they come from the lower classes, and so you wouldn't expect them to do as well. And his very early work in the 1950s was about trying to investigate language codes, analysing the ways in which people speak. As a result of his early work, he identified what he called public and formal language. These ideas transformed to the ideas of elaborated and restricted codes. Now, essentially, the difference here is that working class children spoke in what was called a public language, where there's very little elaboration. Whereas middle-class children grew up learning what he termed initially a formal language, which is an elaborated language. His argument essentially then became that the formal language or elaborated language was the language of the school. And so middle-class children arrived at the school knowing the language code in which schooling occurred, the elaborated code, because they live with it, they grow up with it. Whereas working class children used a much more public language, the restricted code, and they immediately come into an environment where it's normal to speak in an elaborated code. And therefore, those children don't have the language code in order to be able to make sense of what's going on. There are three sets of ideas that Bernstein promoted that we'll talk about: classification and framing, recognition and realisation, and the pedagogic device. Classification and framing then are terms that arise from the early work in sociolinguistics, that they have a broader set of implications than the language codes. They relate to power relations and control. Classification is a term that relates to the strength of the borders between categories, therefore the strength of insulation between categories. So if we take the school system, traditionally there's been a strong separation between preschool, primary school, secondary school, TAFE and university. They've all been separate systems. There are certainly people who move from one to the other, but the systems themselves are quite separate. They traditionally have been strongly insulated, strongly classified. Now, there's been a number of changes in the last few years. So now what we have is vetting schools where people in year 10, 11 and 12 do vocational ed programs. We also have universities who run vet programs. We also have a movement in some areas to the introduction of middle year schools. So what we traditionally had was this very strong boundary maintenance. What we observe is happening, a reduction in the boundary maintenance, a reduction in the insulation between the sectors. That's a change from strong classification to weaker classification. In terms of framing, it refers to as the locus of control. It's a way of describing who has the control over the selection, sequencing, pacing, assessment or evaluation of what the teaching and learning interaction is about. This is an example of framing of evaluation. Strong framing is where the teacher systematically points out what's correct and incorrect in a clear and detailed way. And they use a 4-point coding approach. So this is F++, framing ++4, framing of evaluation. And at the other end you can see weak framing, F minus. The teacher accepts the learner's production, the teacher accepts the learner's answer, and any questions the teacher asks the student are only intended to clarify the meanings of those productions. They're not actually correcting, so they're not actually testing for legitimate or authorised knowledge. And you can see that the F+ and F- in the middle, that there's a progression. And as I said before, they would do that sort of coding for selection, sequence, pacing and evaluation. And what Bernstein's work allows you to do then is to start asking questions about what's happening here. Classification and framing became a way of describing what happened in terms of the transmission, but not what happened in terms of the acquisition. And that's where the idea of recognition and realisation rules came from, saying that in order to be able to understand in an appropriate way what's happening, you need to have developed the recognition rules associated with that particular context. If you have developed the recognition rules, then you're able to understand what's being communicated in an appropriate way for the context. But what you won't be able to do is you won't be able to answer questions or to make that understanding public. Then there are the realisation rules, and realisation rules manifest themselves in two forms. One is what's called passive realisation. Now, in addition to understanding the meaning, here you're able to answer questions or prompts. But what you're still not able to do is make that knowledge public, which is referred to as active realisation. This is a diagrammatic form which says that people can only develop this recognition and realisation rules if they have the appropriate socio-affective dispositions. What that means is people will only develop recognition and realisation rules if their interests, their aspirations and their motivation are consistent with developing the recognition and realisation. The last thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is what's called the pedagogic device. And just to clarify, there is no physical thing called a pedagogic device. This is a conceptual idea. Some people would say, for example, that a computer is a pedagogic device. And in some circumstances it can be. But we're not restricting ourselves to physical. The pedagogic device is composed of three rules. The distribution, recontextualisation and evaluation rules. Distribution rules control who has access to what knowledge. If you work in an occupation which is strongly classified, then it's likely that there will be very strong distribution rules which limit who has access to the knowledge associated with that discipline. It determines who gets what knowledge. And as a result of the knowledge that you are provided access with, that limits the sorts of meanings that you can derive. In Bernstein's terms, it's called the unthinkable and the unthinkable. The distribution rules give rise to the recontextualisation rules. And recontextualisation rules are about bringing the pedagogic discourse, which is privileged by the distribution rules, to reality. And finally, the recontextualisation rules give rise to evaluation rules, which, if you like, think of as assessment rules. Now that's a conceptual idea of what's called a pedagogic device, which is a conceptual idea.